Welcome to the Gnostic Warrior radio show and podcast, broadcasting from GnosticWarrior.com in San Diego, California, to around the world. I'm your host, Mo, and today on the show we have criminal defense attorney Gary Wenkle Smith, who also practices in civil rights and personal injury. He hails here from Southern California in the county of San Bernardino, but he also practices law in Riverside County as well. And being a Gnostic is not just knowing thyself, it's also knowing thy world. You know, that's part of modern Gnosticism, I believe, is learning how to operate in this world. And much of this would be understanding how the legal system works and how the law works. And you need to know the basics, and if you're ever in a situation and you don't understand them, they could be used against you. So it's real important that we understand some of these basics. So I thought it'd be great to have him on the show today, and where he can give us a little bit of background about what it's like being a criminal defense attorney and civil rights defense attorney, and then also some of our rights and what we should say if we're stopped or arrested, and you know, all that kind of stuff, real important stuff, and that goes along the line of knowledge. So anyways, it's again a pleasure to have him on board. How you doing today, Gary?
I am well. How are you?
I'm doing terrific. It's a beautiful day here in Carlsbad, about say 73 degrees. The sun's out. How's it? You're in San Bernardino right now?
I am, and it's a little warmer, I believe, but it's actually a very nice day here today.
Good, good. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, Gary, like where you had grown up, your values and your career path to where you are now as a criminal defense, personal injury, and civil defense attorney?
Well, first of all, I grew up here in San Bernardino, been here all of my life, attended all the public schools. I attended San Bernardino Valley College in the 60s and became a member of a fraternity. I then transferred to Cal State University San Bernardino, where I got a bachelor's degree in psychology. I entered into a master's in clinical psychology as a part-time student because I was then working, and didn't quite finish the program and went to law school. I went to the University of Laverne College of Law and graduated in 1978, and started practicing law in 1979. My values, I think, have always been basic. I was raised in a home where people and respect and good manners were encouraged. Bad language was discouraged. I'm not saying I don't use it from time to time, but we certainly didn't use it in our home. And I think we were a little bit different in that my mother had grown up very impoverished on the south side of Chicago, which at the time was a melting pot. So she wasn't raised with any attitudes toward anybody of a different race or religion. She was just this wonderful person who, by the way, was a county supervisor for 20 years here in San Bernardino. She was the 5th District Supervisor, the first woman to be chairman of the Board of Supervisors, and the second woman to be a county supervisor in the state of California. My father was, he professed that he was a wealthy man because he was fortunate enough to be married to my mother. And he was my best friend. He passed when he was 95 in 2009. So I was one of those folks that was fortunate enough to have parents that were together and that were really great people. Not that I didn't find out some of the answers the hard way, being a hardhead, and it has paid off in a lot of ways. When I was a kid, I got in a lot of trouble for being a smartass, pardon my language, but now I make a living at it. I sincerely believe that our justice system is the key to our freedom. If we don't have a justice system where people are presumed innocent, then people have to fight the awesome power of the government and still come up with evidence to prove that they didn't do what they're being accused of doing. We are an exception to the rule throughout the world. We call ourselves an Anglo-Saxon System of Law, which has primarily to do with William the Conqueror taking over England in 1077 and setting up rules which over the centuries began to evolve, giving people rights. But initially it was all up to the king and whatever rules he chose. And if he wanted you dead, you were dead. If he wanted you imprisoned, that's the way it was. If he wanted to take your family from you, he could do so. And it took centuries for people to begin to develop some rights. And then these amazing people who obviously were inspired by God came upon this land. And although there were a lot of conflicts in their own lifestyles, were able to put to paper ideas that I think are the product of divine inspiration. The language of our Declaration of Independence, the language of our Constitution, the intent of our Constitution, the idea that we have a right to be tried by a jury of our peers. Those kinds of ideas seem to have been a product of divine inspiration. And that's why I am frequently quoting the framers and the founders of this country on my Facebook page. Because I think we constantly need to remember what they said. Now, I'll grant you, as I said earlier, they did some things that don't make sense. For example, they held slaves, yet they spoke of freedom. So I've never been able to reconcile that, but I guess I don't need to because that is not what I do.
Yeah, it's not up to us to judge, but the principles and, I believe as well, the Constitution and our civil rights and everything that has been set up here in the United States of America, those principles, they still hold true today, even though I know there's people out there that might not think so anymore. There's a lot of people, of course, you see a lot of internet dissent. We don't have much internet dissent here, on the streets, but you see that on the internet and, people affecting, our president. And, I know a lot of people, they believe in the Constitution and, of course, our civil rights, and they feel like that we don't have those anymore. Is there any truth to that? People talk about the Patriot Act, and pretty much after that, our Constitution was possibly suspended because they can basically, at any time, the FBI or the federal government exercise the search and seizure without a warrant. Is that true, or am I wrong, Gary?
Well, I think I am probably one of the few people in the world who's actually read the Patriot Act. It's like 342 pages long, and I read it shortly after 9/11. It was passed within 45 days, and shortly after that it was put on the internet, and I read it. And I know that probably no one who voted on it did. We had only one United States senator who voted no, and he has since been he's had his career destroyed by the Republican Party, and he was in fact a Republican. Wisconsin Senator Russ Feingold, he was the one who spoke out and said, "I'm not going to. This is so unconstitutional," and it is. I have no respect for that law because everything in it is intended to abrogate the Constitution. Now, you can't do that. Legislature cannot pass a law that is unconstitutional. However, in order for that to be determined, almost always, it has to be the subject of some kind of litigation. I think the shocking part of it is that we were put in a position where we believed we were under attack. That's a whole other subject for another time, I think, Mo, because I'm one of the people that believes that 9/11 was what we might call an inside job. However, it certainly seemed a convenient time to begin doing things that we all knew were unconstitutional, such as passing the Patriot Act, or the so-called Patriot Act. I do not believe that our constitutional rights have been suspended. And because I practice in a court of law and try cases, I am still in touch with some basic constitutional principles. So I think that one of the words you used earlier is people are angry and they're speaking disrespectfully about us and about our president and so forth. And there are Americans who are doing it. I did not appreciate much about President Bush, but I didn't call him names. And there are things about President Obama that I don't like, but I do not call him names. He is still the president. And the president is, in fact, an institution, not an individual. It is an office established by our Constitution. So we need to deal with issues with respect for all concerned.
I agree. And when you represent a defendant in a criminal case, are you allowed to ask them if they're guilty or they're not guilty or anything like that?
Oh, sure. I mean, I'm allowed to probably ask them anything I want. We do have our private times, whether they're in custody or out. I think the better question is, do I need to know that? And there are those occasions and people I've represented that I considered so serious about the things they do or did with their lives that it probably wasn't a good question to ask. And I think also probably they expected that if I was doing my job, I would know the answers anyway. So,
definitely.
It's not something a lawyer is prevented from doing, but it's something that one probably should be careful about, at least until a relationship is developed. An attorney and a client have an absolute privilege that the client holds, not the lawyer. The client can go and talk about it if the client wants to, but the lawyer cannot ever. There are some limited exceptions, but I don't adhere to any of them. I believe that whatever a client tells me is privilege forever, something I would take to the grave. If they want to go talk about it, that's up to them. That would be against my advice. But a client should feel free to answer my questions should I ask them.
I should know that's an honest answer. And your areas of expertise for the audience are criminal defense, personal injury, and civil defense, right?
Well, I would say my area of expertise is primarily criminal defense, and I do handle primarily serious felonies. I share personal injury cases with my very good friend Mike Scafidi, who I also share office space with, who is a very talented and skilled personal injury lawyer, as well as William Shapiro, who is with a rather sizable firm. So if I have a friend or someone comes to me and they have been injured in some manner, or a family member has, I would bring them in and I would talk with them. I would then bring them to Mike. Mike might bring Bill Shapiro into the case. And we've done that together and helped a lot of people. But I technically am not the guy who would be the lead counsel in a trial should we go to trial. I certainly know how to try just probably any case, and I certainly can fulfill a role in a case. But also, now you said civil defense. Actually, civil rights is an area that I've been interested in, and it's a limited ability as well on my part. The primary interest I have is Section 1983 cases, which are violations of civil rights under color of law. And in my case, that would involve primarily excessive force cases. Sometimes cops do bad things, and sometimes it's intentional. I wouldn't sue a cop for a negligent act, and I don't think that they're liable for it anyway, other than like any everyday person might be. But sometimes they do bad things, and sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes it's just wrong. And it's very difficult, mind you, to prosecute those kinds of cases as a plaintiff's lawyer, because you are then suing a local entity as well, whether it be the city or a county or the state or, even the federal government, although I have not done that. Because the local entity, the city or the county, will use our tax dollars to hire an outside law firm to defeat us. And they don't really put a price tag on how much the outside law firm can spend. So one of the ways they defeat civil rights cases is to paperwork the plaintiff's lawyer to death, to beat them down with costs of litigation. And I tell people, because I get a lot of calls about civil rights cases, hey, they arrested me wrong, they roughed me up, they broke my arm, they thumped me pretty good, they stole my money, and I have to tell people the same thing over and over. Well, I understand how you feel, because I've had my civil rights abused, and I've been beaten by the cops, only when handcuffed, mind you. And, you know, it's a horrible feeling. And it makes you, it's the sense of betrayal is the thing that hurts the most. But to try and remedy that by suing them, you have to be able to finance it. And unless it's just the perfect case these days, I can't go forward with it. It costs too much. I remember a case, a friend of mine's daughter was roughed up pretty bad by a cop, and it was a matter of principle for him. And because he was an old friend, he was paying me by the hour. We didn't expect to get anything out of the case, but the other side billed over $500,000 in attorney's fees.
Jeez.
Yeah, and that's our money.
What is their main interest in defending these? Is it just losing or having that blemish,
That's a
or the money?
question. That's a really great question. I think it's two things. I think one is, yes, just like you said, it's saving face. We don't want that blemish there. The other is that government doesn't want to be responsible for its conduct or the conduct of its law enforcement persons. And it doesn't, therefore, want to be accountable to us. And I suggest that if you look at almost every single officer-involved shooting, you will find that no matter where they are, what county, almost always the district attorney's office finds that it was justified.
Oh, that's always the way it has been, yes. And it's a travesty because, you know, I'm not involved in the justice system as far as your side, but I've been on the other side, and I've been arrested actually numerous times in my younger years, and I've actually went to prison and done time in county, and I've met a lot of dick cops, you know, excuse my language, a lot of jerk cops, but I've also met a lot of good ones that were decent, and if you treat them with respect, they'll treat you with respect. And to be honest, I've met more of them than I've met the others, but I've met quite a few of the others as well, Gary. So I know it's not a blanket statement, you know, when we're talking like this, but of course your business is defending people who are wronged, and sometimes that is the supposedly the right side of the law, and they're people, right? Just like you and I.
Well, true, and it isn't a blanket statement for me either. I tell juries during the course of jury selection, what we call voir dire, that, you know, if the case involves critical testimony by cops, I tell them, you know, I want you to know that some of my favorite people in the world are cops, and that some of my least favorite people in the world are cops. So I agree with you, Mo. It's not all cops. I mean, what would we do without them? We would really have some serious issues if we didn't have cops, wouldn't we?
I agree. I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, and like I said, some of my favorite people are cops. I've known some really good people throughout my career, some of whom are friends, some of whom we go to dinner with, and then there are some of those who make everybody look bad, just like some lawyers make all lawyers look bad.
Yeah, and that's the tough thing, and I know you know, people sometimes they take it in the wrong context, and you know, they might hear us talking, or they might see something on the news, or they might have been wronged by a police officer or someone on the other side, or supposedly the right side of the law, and they kind of have the tendency to put that blanket statement on it. But I agree, you know, even though I've been on the left side of the law and the wrong side of the law, and the law won, I don't know what we would do without the system. There, in other countries such as Iran, you know, I got in trouble for growing and sales of marijuana. You know, in Iran, I would have had my head cut off or died by, you know, killed by a firing squad. China, same thing. You know, literally, probably the majority of the countries in the world, I would have been executed on the first one. And here I am, you know, given a second chance. And it's been 10 years now since it had happened, you know, and I'm thankful now that I've learned all these things. See, I didn't learn those things before, Gary, and I was one of those guys that was always, you know, it's always the law, the blanket statement, they're all jerks, you know, until I got educated. And it's a great system we have here, and I still do believe that the Constitution is in effect, and you're there in the courtrooms now today, of course, using it, and it's still in effect because people would be getting thrown left and right, and there would be no trial by jury, right, into jails?
Well, if we didn't have trial by jury, it would be the end of America. That's what would happen. There would be no America, and that's the way I discuss it with jurors, people who our prospective jurors, this is a sacred kind of thing that we're doing when we're trying a case, particularly a criminal case, because we're asking people to step outside of their daily world and all those prejudices that we've just talked about, all those dislikes and all those likes. Because some people just love cops and some people just hate cops. And some people hate people with tattoos and some people hate people of a different color. And so we have to ask them to engage in an experiment, because that's what it is. And it's an experiment in freedom. We're asking them for this time while they are there with us to embrace a presumption that the defendant, as they see him, is innocent until proven otherwise. And that is against human nature. It really is. So what an amazing concept, huh?
It is. It is. And I'm thankful that we have that. And sometimes I get a little upset when I see people, I'll see them on Facebook talking about, I have jury duty, and they're just like, oh, and just dreading it. I know it's difficult because, they have to have those long days and it's outside of the norm, but I like the way you put it. It's a gift. It's a gift that we have that. And people that go to, the jury, and they need to understand that. And a lot of them, unfortunately, have not been on the other side, so a lot of them don't understand, But do you still see a lot of heart in the juries? I know you're on some very serious cases. You try murder cases, I assume, and everything serious felonies you had mentioned?
Yes, and I see that jurors, if they are sincerely engaged by the lawyer or lawyers, hopefully all lawyers, but some lawyers just don't seem to have that thing going on. But if we engage them, we bond, and we bond in the experience, and they want to know what's going on, and they don't want to be misled. And, I tell clients, look, you're the defendant in this case, and yes, you're supposed to have a presumption of innocence, but if you get up on the witness stand and you tell one lie, you are done. So some of my clients don't testify. But the point of all that is, and this is part of, one of my, what I consider major accomplishments as a lawyer, is that the training that I have engaged in, I have involved myself in with the Trial Lawyers College and with Jerry Spence and with literally hundreds of wonderful attorneys all over the United States, is that we are about being real and about engaging people and asking them to really participate with us, because we need them, and we need them to love this process and love us and love our clients, because the system of justice in any country, including this, can be very harsh. Because, for example, in California, the case is entitled, "The People of the State of California versus so-and-so, the defendant." Well, there are 35 million people in California, and the government tends to have unlimited funds to prosecute people, where oftentimes the defendant has me and my investigator, and that's it. And sometimes we get experts into the case. But so it's a process, and it has to be dealt with the utmost respect.
Definitely. What are some of the difficulties you face in a criminal or civil rights case? I know you had mentioned money and unlimited funds, especially when the government is involved, and in basically every criminal case, it's the government against the criminal, the defendant, the alleged criminal.
Yes.
What are the main difficulties?
Well, I think some of the main difficulties are, of course, that you're fighting a very powerful force, the government, that does in fact have unlimited funds. The prosecutor has all of the evidence first. They have all of the witnesses first. They have the largest investigative agency around working for them, the cops, the police, and they work for the largest law firm in town. And they have a budget that, at least to me, the defense lawyer, seems, unending. So it is a difficult process, because oftentimes we get the case, and a lot of work has been done on the other side, and oftentimes it's very good work. And we're in the process of trying to develop a defense for someone. And sometimes, for example, in the Dennis Fletcher trial, where he was being prosecuted for killing 3 people, and he did kill them, we had to put on a defense that showed that what the prosecution was alleging without experts was simply incorrect. And in fact, to this day, I still don't have any idea how the prosecution came up with its ideas. But we had to put on all of the scientific evidence because the prosecution chose not to do that. Now, you might think, well, we can just sit back and say, hey, he didn't prove anything. But when a guy is facing a conviction for 3 murders, you do everything you can to help save his life.
So that trial was coming down to his life, basically, or life in prison?
Well, yes, the prosecution, for some reason, prior to my entry into the case, chose not to go for death. Multiple deaths is grounds for a death penalty case. He also alleged lying in wait, which is grounds for a death penalty case. But he chose not to. And, of course, what difference would it have made if he was convicted? He was facing 150 years to life. So he chose not to do that. But we did win the case, and we won the case because we were able to present the truth of the case to the jury. And I had to beg for funds because Dennis was living off of disability. His family had hired me, but they didn't have unlimited funds. So I had to beg the court for money for experts, which we did get. And it's a process, and there's procedures for it. And the judge in charge of it reviewed everything carefully. He really did his job. But Dennis stayed in jail for 20 months. And part of that was when I was his lawyer. About 8 months of that was when I was his lawyer. So for a guy who is wrongfully accused, which Dennis was, life can be real difficult. And it's difficult to keep a man like Dennis from feeling a total loss. So I go visit him. I spend time with my clients, and if they're in jail, I go see them. It was a horrible, traumatic experience for him to have to kill 3 people. And what he got for it was incarceration. And a long term, really. I mean, 20 months is a long time to sit in jail, 21 months.
What was the nature of the facts of the case, if you don't mind saying, Gary?
I don't mind at all. Dennis had an ongoing dispute with his neighbor, and he lived out in the middle of the desert. And his neighborhood was, by definition, the middle of nowhere. It was an area with no streets other than dirt roads, sandy dirt roads, no street lights. And his neighbor had a couple guys living with her, and one of them started threatening Dennis. And it was over an age-old dispute over Dennis remaining friends with one of her past boyfriends. And so one night, with the wind blowing and it was cold, 2 of the deceased, the 2 men, smoked some speed, and this is all a matter of record, and with the woman, who was under the influence of fentanyl, which is about 100 times more powerful than morphine, literally, and alcohol, as well as another gal who, of course, professed her innocence in any way other than she just came along, walked over to his house and left tracks in the sand, approaching his house or his driveway from 3 different angles. And when his dog started barking, he came out. They attacked him. He was a Boy Scout. He was prepared. And he had a .357 revolver in his left front pocket. They came at him as though he were right-handed. But for that, he would be dead. He drew, and the first shot was, by our expert, estimated to be 5 inches from the man's chest. The prosecutor was alleging that he shot these people in the street, that he ambushed them, but all of the physical evidence was in his driveway. And it was 3 quick shots, all of which were shots through the heart. And these people just turned around and walked off and left a trail of blood and collapsed in the street several feet away. And Dennis didn't even know whether he'd killed them. But we had to present the defense because I think, as I said earlier, that this idea of presuming people to be innocent is against our nature. we tend to think the worst of people. I just think that's the way it is. Maybe that's the way we're raised. I don't know. But to get people to agree that they will engage in this experiment of presuming a person to be innocent. I even asked them to vote while we're doing our jury selection. How would you vote right now? Those of you who would vote not guilty, raise your hands. Sometimes everybody votes not guilty. Sometimes I get 3 or 4 votes, and I have to ask people why. And they'll say things like, well, I want to hear the facts, which, of course, is good for discussion because there are no facts. That is the point of presuming someone innocent. But in Dennis's case was what I consider one of the greatest moments in my career because, first of all, he was an innocent man, a truly innocent man. And he walked out of the courtroom the day the jury came back. And he'd been in custody all of that time. They attempted to process him back through the system, and we refused to allow them to do that. The bailiffs were very cool about it. In fact, they were very supportive of him being found not guilty. So we let him get some paperwork and gave him a thumbprint, and Dennis walked out the courthouse that day.
Now, that's a great story, Gary. You know, this gentleman, you know, in the desert, I actually heard of stories like this. I have a friend that lives in San Bernardino in the Apple Valley area, and it's all desert out there, acreage properties, so people can kind of get a picture. We have people all over listening to the show. There's a lot of desert area out there. There's mountains and so forth. So I've heard of this happening. Actually, he had a neighbor that got into a shootout with his neighbor, and no one was killed, fortunately, but you know, one of the guys did time for firing a weapon. He did a few years, you know, and it was one of those ongoing disputes, neighbors. So that does happen. But, you know, definitely when people hear murder, they just presume guilty. And you know, this man definitely was not guilty, and he needed you. And luckily he found you. You know, the question that I have listening to the story is, why would the prosecution, they probably knew some of these things. They knew that they were high on drugs. Why wouldn't they present any of this evidence? Is it just that's the way they do things?
You know, that's a question that I have never been able to answer, and I mean it sincerely. Of course the prosecution knew about the toxicology report showing the level of methamphetamine, which was very, very high. The prosecution knew about the stippling around the wound, which is burned and unburned gunpowder that only occurs at close range. The prosecution knew about the gunshot residue on the other 2, which was in very high concentration, which only occurs at 2.5 to 3 feet away. The prosecution knew that there was blood on his driveway from 2 of the deceased, although they never did any DNA work. It was easy to track it from which way the 2 men went. And we're talking about very large men, by the way. These guys were well over 6 feet, both of them over 300 pounds. The woman was almost 6 feet tall and 220 pounds. So just imagine if those 3 got him to the ground and sat on top of him.
Wow.
Yeah. But back to your question, I don't know. I've never understood why Dennis was prosecuted unless it was, okay, let's just put it out there and let the people decide because 3 people are dead and we need to do this. Yet the prosecutor was very enthusiastic in his presentation that it was basically an ambush when there was really not one scintilla of evidence to establish that. In fact, quite the contrary. All of the evidence was on Dennis's property. All of the evidence favored Dennis. So I kind of thought maybe he'd been assigned the duty and he felt he had to do it and be as enthusiastic as he could. And then if Dennis was set free, okay, they'd done their job. I guess that's giving him the benefit of the doubt.
It is. You know, I know when I was in Riverside County, that's where, you know, I'd gotten in trouble. They had a 98, the prosecution, the Riverside County had a 98% success rate. And we on the other side, of course, knew that, and it's pretty daunting understanding that. And, of course, the 2% would be the cases such as it was Dennis Fletcher, right, that you had represented?
Fletcher, yes, and he was out in San Bernardino County, but I've tried a lot of cases in Riverside too, and I know what you're talking about. They did boast that. What that meant, of course, wasn't that they took all those cases to trial and won, was that they got people to plead guilty to things. And if you charge me with murder and I plead guilty to misdemeanor resisting arrest, you still got a conviction. And
correct.
I think that was the way they well, that's how their statistics were presented. And Riverside's been through some serious turmoil in terms of prosecutors, the last of which was it backlogged the system because there was no plea bargaining going on. It was just plea as charged, and the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of California, sent out what they called a strike team to try cases. And I tried a few cases during that time, and people in Riverside were pretty angry with the way things were going with their system. So the defense benefited greatly from that, and they lost over 50% of their trials.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been, like I said, several years. It's been almost a decade now since I've had those problems, but it was pretty bad at the time, you know, and
yeah.
It's we used to call the public defenders public pretenders, you know. And anyways, I'm thankful for some of the things that I've been through, but I've been on the other side, and, you know, I understand what it's like to be accused, and you have one or two charges, and all of a sudden it gets to 10 or 12. And in the end, you usually only plead to one, and it's difficult. What are some of the basics that we all should know about law if someone is to get arrested or questioned by the police?
On my website, GaryWenklesmith.com, and by the way, my middle name is Wenkle. I write about that, and I have rule number 1, and I tell people this all the time, and I don't know why they break it, but they do. And rule number 1 is never talk to the cops. Don't tell them anything. And rule number 2 is never break rule number 1. And the reason for that is, look, in my experience, cops are smart. They're well trained, and they're good at what they do. And if 2 of them get you talking, you're done. I don't care who you are. And you know, there are those occasional cops who will say that you said things that you didn't say. So why take that risk? But more importantly, if in fact you have done something, and you need to remember that cops are jaded. Just like we all get jaded about certain things in life, they're jaded about people because their daily lives don't involve seeing the best of people. Their daily lives involve seeing the worst of people. And they see things that we don't want to see, and that's why we have them take care of it. They see human beings get shot and killed and butchered, and they see children get hurt, and they see all of the ugliness of life. And so if they're a good cop, which, like you said, and I agree, most of them are, they're pretty determined people, men and women who are real good at what they do. And if they get you talking, you're in trouble. So why ever risk that and try to explain anything to them? Because it isn't going to make any difference what you say if they think that they have cause to arrest you. So I point to the old adage or the old saying, you know, it is better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to open one's mouth and remove all doubt.
I agree, Gary. What do you have to say when they ask you a question? I know there's certain questions you must answer, such as your name and give them your license. Is that where it stops? Anything after that, especially if you're accused of a crime?
I don't think you have to answer any questions. I think if you're stopped in a vehicle and you're asked for your driver's license, I think you're obliged to show it because driving is a privilege and you need to show that proof. And if you were asked for your registration, I believe you have to show it. And if you're asked for proof of insurance, I believe you have to show it. And if you're asked anything else, I don't think you need to answer that. If they believe that they have some cause to detain you, to write you a traffic ticket, then let them do it. Don't try and argue with them. Don't try and be cute. Don't get mad. If, you know, in most cases, and I'll use myself as an example, I haven't been pulled over by a cop too many times when it was wrong. There have been those occasions when I think maybe a cop made an honest mistake. And there have been those occasions when I think there are cops who are just out there making sure that they're getting their quota. But for the most part, let's just assume that it's a legitimate stop. When they start asking questions, you don't need to say anything. You give them your driver's license, you give them your proof of insurance, you give them your registration. End of story. Now, if you're being detained for a criminal case, you don't say anything. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to give them your license. You don't have to identify yourself on a public street.
They're going to arrest you anyway.
Well, probably, and if they do, okay, at least you didn't give them something. I had a little encounter, for example. I was at a gathering of some dear friends of mine who are what I would call motorcycle enthusiasts. And sometimes some cops show up and they want to show everybody who's the boss. And there were probably maybe 300 motorcycle enthusiasts at this event. And these two cops were acting out. They chased a guy down the street, and you had to kind of go up a ramp to get into the parking lot. It was kind of up the ramp and then down. So they had it narrowed off with cones so that a vehicle could get through, because the cops were entitled to drive in, but they'd have to go very slowly. So these guys were chasing a guy that they later said they had seen run a stoplight. And they raced by us, probably going 40 miles per hour. And there were two rows of us standing on either side of the entranceway. I was standing with a friend of mine and his son, and these guys came by and missed me by about an inch. Missed the guy's son, too. So I yelled at them, and then I went over and spoke with the appropriate individual to get permission to confront them, and I did. And I kept my distance while this guy's writing this guy a ticket, and I yelled at him and told him he almost ran me over. And he shouted back to me that when you see the red lights, you get the fuck out of the way. Pardon my language, but that's what he said. And I had some words for him. So I asked him who he thought he was. And about that time, someone else got out of the vehicle wearing sergeant stripes. And he's all buffed out, and probably unnaturally so. And started approaching me and said, "What's the problem here?" And I said, "You know what the problem is? You almost ran me over." He said, "It wasn't that close." And I said, "Oh, is that your excuse for that kind of behavior?" He said, "Let me see some ID." I said, "No, you're not entitled to my identification." He said, "What?" I said, "You heard me." I said, "I will tell you. My name's Gary Smith, and my address is 432 North Arrowhead Avenue, San Bernardino, just a block above the courthouse. I'm the easiest guy in Purdue to find. And you will hear more from me, because I'm going to write a letter to the sheriff about you and your associate over here and the way you behave with people." And he just kind of threw his hands up in the air and turned around and walked away. One of the guys came over to me and said, "Can you refuse to give them ID?" I said, "Didn't you just see me do that?" And he said, "But you're a lawyer." And I said, he didn't know that until the end of the conversation. It was because I refused to cooperate with his bullying tactic that he couldn't do anything.
Wow, what an incredible story, Gary. My next question is in regards to relationships with the court and opposing counsel. I know you've been asked on several occasions what kind of relationships you have with judges and prosecutors.
Well, I think it's really important that a lawyer show the utmost respect to everyone involved in a case. Prosecutors can't speak to my client. They're prohibited from doing it unless, of course, my client agrees and I give them permission. But that's not what that's about. It's about respect. This is an important proceeding, and I am an officer of the court. The prosecutor is an officer of the court. And we are there to follow the law. We can argue the law, and we can argue what we think it is, or even acknowledge what it is and argue what we think it should be. But our conduct in a courtroom is really important, as how the rest of the public, the rest of the world sees our legal system. If a lawyer is afraid to stand up for his clients, people feel defeated already. If a lawyer is rude, either to the court or to opposing counsel, it really takes away from the proceedings, and people lose respect for the proceedings. So although I'm not concerned necessarily whether any particular judge or any particular prosecutor likes me, I am concerned that no one is ever able to say that I've been disrespectful in a courtroom. And I do believe that almost all of the judges I encounter reciprocate. Occasionally there's someone that's got their own problems, and sometimes people make it to the bench. They get appointed to the bench mistakenly, in my book. I don't want to name names because I don't really have any beef with anyone in particular, because I do my job. And it's a little bit difficult to stop someone who's been doing what I've been doing as long as I have and is doing what he's supposed to be doing. So most judges don't try and interfere with that. But the word respect is always the basis of it. We should always show respect. And if another lawyer is disrespectful to me, I await their apology. And if they don't, they just cease to exist. I won't look at them. I won't acknowledge their presence. And I've had to do that with a couple of attorneys. And over time, they got the idea and finally apologized for the behavior. So relationships with court and counsel are important. They're really very important. And they should always begin with respect.
No, I agree. It goes down to the old adage, treat others as you want to be treated. And, you being in a court in such a high-stress situation, with other people that are opposing it, you treat them with respect, and everybody does their job and be professional. And hopefully the one with the best evidence and the most money wins, I guess, sometimes, right?
Well, sometimes it seems that way, doesn't it? The most money. Cost OJ, what, $12 million to walk out of a courtroom?
Yeah.
But that was just money. I don't know. That's a whole other story, and I really don't want to get off on that. But
yeah, I know. It seems though justice does serve sometimes, because look where he's at now. But, that is one of those things where money does buy. It seems that money does buy freedom.
Well, he certainly hired some really great lawyers, okay? Barry Scheck, who is the king on DNA, who has started the Innocence Project, is just one of the greatest lawyers alive today. Johnny Cochran isn't alive, but he certainly seized the moment, didn't he?
Definitely. Definitely.
He sure did.
I know we just had the recent big trial that was a sensation across the country, the Zimmerman and the Martin case, and I know that a lot of people got real emotional about it, and it seemed like a lot of racial division across America. And I know it's a touchy subject, and I really don't want to talk about much, but Zimmerman was found not guilty, and you didn't really mention anything but the system that we have here in the trial by jury.
Yes.
And that I'll have if you don't mind, I'll just quote you here. It says, "We have a system of justice that provides us with a right to trial by jury of our peers. All parties participate in the selection of the jury. 12 people deliberate. If the prosecution did not overcome its burden of proof, the jury must find the defendant not guilty. When a not guilty verdict is rendered, the case is over, forever, period."
Yes.
It is a part, yeah, there's one last thing. There's a part of our social contract that we respect this verdict because we live in America, and that is our system of justice. No threats of violence should ever be made, as they might give cause to believe there is an effort to dissuade this process. That kind of behavior is unacceptable. I will say no more on the subject at this time. And I thought that was just really eloquent.
Well, thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you. And that was a very emotional time for us. It still is, I think, because, racial animosity in America is still an issue. We have a president, our first African-American president, and I know that a lot of the people that say things that they say it because he's a black man, not because they don't like that he's doing a good job or whatever. I believe that.
I believe it too.
Yeah. And I have friends that have their opinions, both white, black, Mexican, you name it. I'm friends with people of all races and all religions. And I know that when someone uses the N-word, that doesn't necessarily make them a racist, but it's certainly a word that brings pain to people and should clearly be avoided. The Zimmerman case, the jury spoke. They only had 6 people on that jury. I've never tried a case like that, but that's the issue of their system of justice in Florida. My point on that was the jury has spoken. To say that they're going to go to the federal government now and try to come after him for violation of the young man's civil rights is just simply out of the question. If this Zimmerman fellow were a police officer and acting under color of law, then there might be some kind of civil rights violation. But he had a trial, and he was found not guilty, and it's over. There's no more to be said. If people don't like the verdict, I'm sorry. I don't know enough about what happened that night for me to even comment on that. And I wouldn't anyway, because I wasn't one of the lawyers in the trial, and I wasn't one of the witnesses in the trial, and I don't have time to watch somebody else's trial on television. I just know the jury spoke, and we should respect that, whether we like it or not. Because if people start talking about, and media was trying to do this, this is my big grudge right here, is what our media attempted to do on a daily basis. They had headlines that riots were threatened if Zimmerman found not guilty. It was as though they were attempting to incite racial riots in this country, and almost succeeded, except for Trayvon Martin's parents have such great hearts. And they felt that although they wanted George Zimmerman convicted, they felt that it would dishonor their son's life and our justice system for people to take it to the streets in a violent manner. And they're probably the main reason that that the media didn't succeed in causing race riots in this country, because there were people just dying to get a chance to do it on both sides. And that's the last thing America needs, is that kind of violence. So when people say that they're going to do something violent if a jury verdict doesn't turn out a certain way, shame on them. That's the kind of behavior I certainly won't tolerate.
No, I agree, Gary. Shame on the media as well. It was a media circus during the time, and you often wonder, why is it like this sometimes here? We live in a great country, and then it seems sometimes that it's getting worse and worse as far as the media and what is on TV, and it's a joke. And I agree. They were trying to incite racial division, and they succeeded in, I feel, a lot of ways. It seems like it's getting back to normal, but I did feel a little bit of tension. Stuff that I would feel actually in jail or prison at times, I was feeling on the street in certain situations. Not a lot, but there was certain situations where it was getting during that trial that there was a lot of tension.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah. And media was playing it all they could, because they wanted to distract us from what's really going on. During that very same period of time, the NSA had been exposed, and the young man who exposed them had to flee this country. And I'm not addressing whether he was right or wrong in what he did, but we found out about it because of that. We found out that our government is spying on us. And recently there's a headline that the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, is spying on us. How did they get that? And we have wars going on. Our wars are supposedly over, yet we're using drones to attack people all the time. So I think it was a really great distraction. If George Zimmerman was motivated by racial hatred, okay, then he was. But he certainly didn't speak for me. And I believe that he didn't speak for the majority of Americans. And I'm pretty sure George Zimmerman wasn't white anyway. So the racial thing was played by the media and by people who make money off of that kind of thing. And shame on them, too, because a lot of people could have been hurt unnecessarily.
I agree. My understanding is that technically it was Latin, because Mexican, part Mexican, or one of those Latin countries. Anyways, we don't need to talk more about that. I appreciate you, answering what you did on it. And let's go to the next thing here. As far as the different laws that we should know, what are the basics? I know as far as if we're arrested, we're not to talk to the police or anything like that. What are the basic laws that we should understand as far as a citizen? What are the basics?
Well, good. I'm glad we got back to that. I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there. One of the things, of course, we talked about was the right to remain silent. Invoke that right. We also have the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, which in my advice is don't give consent to search ever. Not under any circumstances, ever. And I've had cops tell me, well, if you got nothing to hide, why don't you let us come in and look at your house? They say that to people. Well, everybody's got something they don't want everyone seeing. What if you got a photograph of your wife or girlfriend that you don't want everybody to look at? What if you wrote a love note to your boyfriend and you don't want people to know you're gay? Those are things that the Fourth Amendment protects. We're right to be secured in our papers and things. But people so frequently get, I would say, bullied into giving up those rights. For example, I'm driving down the street. I'm doing 60 miles an hour in a 55 zone. I'm in violation of the law. And I get pulled over. The officer says, give me your license, registration, proof of insurance. I give those things to him. He said, well, you step out of the car, please. And I comply because I believe he has the right to ask me to do that too. And then he says, all right, I want to search your car. And I tell him, no. And he said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. Well, you don't have any right to do that, and I'm not going to give you that right. And everybody that knows me knows I would never give that right away. And the Fourth Amendment tells me that I don't have to give you that right. You know that, officer. Unless you suspect me of some criminal activity and that the evidence of it is in my car, like if you think I'm drunk. You know, if people are under the influence or they smell of alcohol or they're acting strange, cops can search the car to look what got them there. First, they have to make some basic determinations about them. But if they just pull me over and say they want to search, well, they don't have any right to do that. If they come knocking on my door, they have a procedure they call knock and talk, where they have a suspicion about someone. And like I said, look, cops are smart, and they're usually fairly correct in what they have observed. So they'll go do a knock and talk and get people talking to them. And then they'll say, well, hey, do you mind me coming in and looking around? And by then, if people have spent that kind of time talking with them, they'll usually say, sure, because they don't think they will. Or if they say, hey, can I search your car? And they say, sure, go ahead. They say that because they don't think they will. Well, I assure you, if a law enforcement person asks you for permission to search and you give it, they will search. But you do not have to give it. Not ever. If they come with a search warrant to your home and they knock on the door and you let them in, they have the right to come in if it's a valid search warrant. Better not get in the way of that. Go sit down and shut up. If they pull,
yeah. No, it's funny you say that, the knock and talk. That actually is what happened to me in Corona, California in 2002. They did a knock and talk. They got a call from my ex-wife, who actually was going through a divorce at the time, and I had a previous case in '96 in Orange County, but they came to the door, and I actually was researching all that, I'd say a few weeks before, so I was pretty familiar with the Fourth Amendment, and they asked me if they could come in, and I said no, and they ended up forcing me on the ground with two detectives above me, and they had a police officer, two clothed police officers, and then two detectives, and then one of the police officers went in, and they found a room locked, and I ended up, right when they were coming out, I ended up running, and they tackled me like 15 feet away. They were right there, and they got me for resisting arrest and, of course, growing in sales. But my big defense was the Fourth Amendment, that they violated that.
Yeah.
And it was going well until I had more charges brought against me from the county in Corona, and I ended up getting arrested again, and it just snowballed from there, and I ended up having to plea. So, and I couldn't afford a lawyer at the time, but I was actually, I believe that I won, because I got in trouble for about 65 plants that I had at the time, and I only got 4 months, and it was the other thing that ended up getting me more in trouble, and I ended up getting prison time. Was the other case that I had caught when I was out on bail. They called it a bail-on-bail crime.
Right. It's called the out-on-bail allegation, committing a crime while released on bail. It's a separate crime and an enhancement is what it is.
Correct. And when you're on that side, it just snowballs from there, and you feel like the whole world's against you, and they're like working 24/7 against you. And it's a terrible place to be. And thank God that there's people like you out there, Gary, that I met a tremendous amount of people when I was in county that I feel were innocent, and they just didn't have the money, or they did have a lawyer like you on the outside, and of course there was a lot of people in there as well that were in there because they deserved to be, and of course they were fighting to get less time. You're facing 100 years or 50 years. Of course, you want to fight it as long as you can, in county.
Well, yeah, yeah, absolutely. For a lot of people in jail, it's a hopeless feeling for them, and there are a lot of people in there who are back again for the 5th or 10th time, and it is a vicious cycle. And then there are people like you who have a case going, and it's looking bad for the prosecution, and suddenly you become a focus because they're not going to let you get away. And if you're doing anything that they can get you for, they will. And so, one of my basic rules in this life is, for God's sake, don't do anything illegal. It's not worth it. The price is so heavy, people don't know unless they've been through it, like you, Mo. People don't know just how ominous and oppressive our government can be when you become their target. And so, again, you stood up for your rights. I'm glad you did, and people need to do that. People need to know that they can, and that, yeah, you might take some heat for it. The cops might still arrest you, but at least you didn't give them anything. And later on, when the time comes, you can argue, well, I didn't give them permission to enter my home. I would never do that. I've had plenty of conversations with my lawyer, and that's one of the basic ground rules of him being willing to represent me, is that I never give up my rights. And, people today aren't any different than they were 100 years ago. Actually, maybe much more submissive than they were 100 years ago. People want to have a good, comfortable life, and they want to believe in the goodness of government. So when a cop comes, he knows those things, and if he wants something from them and they are willing to submit in any manner, he's going to get exactly what he wants, or she. We got some great lady cops out there too. So people need to know their rights. Don't help them prosecute you.
Definitely, I agree. You don't want to help them when they already have sometimes unlimited funds, but there's definitely hope out there, for people that might be, facing a criminal case, or in the future, that there's lawyers like you out there. And you could find Gary Wenkle Smith. Again, it's Gary and then Wenkle, Wenkle, Smith.com is his website. And what's great is you're also a poet and a painter, and I feel an all-around cool dude.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely, and I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. You're a friend on Facebook, and you have a great website, GaryWenklesmithArt.com, where you could see some of his art, and it kind of shows you, I believe, who you are as a person, because it's not always what you say; it's your works that speak for yourself. And I feel you're on the right side of the law as far as in practicing law. When you're representing those people that are facing some of the worst situations they can be and facing a lot of time in prison, and there's people like you willing to dedicate their lives to the justice system and to justice and to helping those people. It's great, and it's warm. And I'm glad that I've had you on my podcast, and I feel people need to learn about the law and their rights. And it's just basic, learn your rights, respect people, respect the police, and then if you're accused of a crime, they're going to arrest you anyway. Don't say anything. Is there anything you would like to end this podcast with, Gary?
Well, I want to thank you for the time to share with you, Mo. We seem to be, on the same wavelength about a lot of stuff. And I've read your GnosticWarrior.com site quite a bit recently, and you posted a couple of my poems on there, and I appreciate that very much too. So I just hope that people will recognize that we are the exception in the world. We have this thing we call freedom, and you don't get to keep it if you give it up. And our personal freedom is something that we have to cherish more than ever, because if I don't have freedom, you don't have freedom. If we give up our freedom, who knows what kind of rulers we'll have, because there are plenty who would love to do that. So embrace and cherish those rights that we've been given. Keep your mouth shut. Don't let them search you.
And don't be intimidated. To give them respect, but don't be intimidated to do that. And if you got to do a little time in jail, so be it.
So be it. It's not the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing that could happen is that they would use you against yourself.
Correct, or we would live in a society where there would be no due process and no trial.
Right.
And then that's definitely a different world than we live in now. And there's still hope out there, and you're definitely one of those people, Gary, that give me hope. And you always have a great attitude, you know, and I think that's important in life as well, as being positive. You know, even through the stress and the difficulties that we have, we got to try to remain positive and look at the positive side of things, even when we're confronting the negative.
Well, I agree with you, Mo, and I try to remain positive about it, because if I'm negative, that certainly doesn't help my clients who are sitting there in custody or facing the worst possible times of their lives. So I need to be the positive force in their lives, and part of that comes from doing what I am supposed to do. I
agree, Gary. And audience, if you'd like to check out Gary's work, go to GaryWenklesmith.com and then GaryWenklesmithArt.com as well. It's been a pleasure, Gary. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Mo. Thank you, and I really appreciate it.
Okay, take care. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.